There's a quiet kind of influence that never raises its voice. It doesn't shout, threaten, or demand. It simply moves softly through tone, timing, and human instinct. Most people never notice it, yet they feel it in their choices, in their emotions, in the subtle pressure that bends them toward something they didn't intend. Dark psychology often hides not in cruelty but in the familiar patterns people fall into as they want approval, safety, or certainty. It works in shadows not because it's evil, but because it slips beneath awareness. This story is not about manipulation, but about recognition of how influence forms, how it spreads, and how it quietly shapes the human heart. There are moments when influence enters a room long before any words arrive. A glance, a pause, a softened tone that feels less like speech and more like a door left slightly open. People rarely notice the opening. They simply walk through it, believing the decision was their own. This is the quiet nature of suggestion. Never forceful, never loud, yet capable of shaping choices with almost invisible precision. Recognition often begins with an unsettling realization. People respond more easily to what feels gentle than to what feels demanding. A suggestion carries no threat, yet it creates an inner pull, a sense that agreeing will keep the peace, maintain harmony, or protect a fragile moment. The emotional beginning of this pattern usually rests in the desire to avoid friction. Humans are wired to sense tension, and even the slightest hint of conflict can trigger an instinctive search for the safest path. A suggestion softly delivered often feels like that path. The roots of this instinct stretch far back into social evolution. Early humans survived not through dominance, but through cooperation. The group's approval was a form of safety. Isolation, even the emotional kind, carried danger. So the mind learned to respond to subtle cues. A shift in tone, a rising or falling of breath, a quiet emphasis placed on a single word. People listened not only to what was said, but to what was implied. This sensitivity still lives in modern minds, guiding decisions before logic even arrives. Psychologically, suggestion thrives in the space between awareness and assumption. The brain prefers shortcuts. When someone speaks gently or confidently, the mind fills in the gaps, creating meaning where none was explicitly stated. This is why suggestion can feel like intuition. It bypasses the conscious gatekeeper. A slight tilt of the head implies agreement. A thoughtful pause implies importance. A simple phrase, "You might like this," sounds harmless. Yet it plants a seed the mind begins nurturing on its own. The inner conflict arises when people sense influence but cannot trace its source. There's a faint discomfort, a quiet question. Did I choose this, or was I guided? Yet most move past the feeling quickly. Confronting subtle influence requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement often risks disrupting the harmony people try to maintain. So the mind takes the easier route, accepting the suggestion and silencing the doubt. But there is always a turning point. It comes when someone notices the pattern repeating, small choices bending in familiar directions, emotions shifting without clear cause, decisions that feel strangely effortless but not entirely free. In that moment, awareness begins to sharpen. The suggestion shape becomes visible, and the mind recognizes how easily softness can mask direction. Integration does not reject suggestion, it simply sees it. It understands that influence can be gentle and still powerful, subtle and still intentional. With awareness, suggestion becomes transparent, no longer an invisible pull, but a visible thread woven through human interaction. And in this clarity, one truth quietly emerges. People are not controlled by force, but by the warmth of what feels natural. Suggestion lives in that warmth, shaping choices softly, silently, one unspoken cue at a time. There's a particular stillness that settles between people, an unspoken field where decisions shift, emotions bend, and actions align without a single word being exchanged. Silence is often mistaken for emptiness, yet it carries a weight that shapes human behavior with surprising force. In groups, that weight becomes even heavier. People watch, people adjust, people conform to what seems expected even when the expectation is never voiced. Recognition begins with a universal experience, the quiet pressure to fit into a moment. A room with unfamiliar faces, a conversation where one person holds subtle authority, a situation where speaking up feels risky. In those spaces, silence becomes a cue, a message delivered indirectly, asking for compliance without demanding it. Humans respond to this unspoken message instinctively, shifting themselves toward belonging, safety, and acceptance. The roots of this instinct run deep into collective survival. For early humans, harmony within the group was not optional, it was life-preserving. Conflict threatened stability, dissent threatened unity. So the brain adapted to read subtle emotional atmospheres. A stare lingering too long, a gesture left incomplete, a pause that carried tension. These cues taught individuals where they stood and how they needed to move. That ancient instinct remains alive today, guiding choices in offices, relationships, friendships, and even casual interactions. Psychologically, this pattern is known as implied authority, a silent hierarchy formed not by words but by presence. A confident person creates a gravitational field. A quiet leader shapes direction without announcing intention. People sense their cues and adjust themselves automatically, believing they are acting independently even as they fall into alignment. Authority expressed through silence often feels more powerful than authority expressed through speech, because the mind fills in the meaning. And what the mind fills in, it trusts more deeply. Alongside implied authority lives another silent pattern, the mirroring effect. Humans copy without noticing. They match posture, tone, breathing rhythm. They adopt emotional energy and reflect attitudes as if synchronizing with an unseen pulse. Mirroring makes social cohesion effortless, but also makes silent influence easy. A calm demeanor encourages calm. A disapproving silence creates discomfort. A subtle shift in expression can guide someone's next move more effectively than a long explanation. The inner conflict around social silence is subtle but persistent. People often feel themselves adjusting, yet cannot identify why. There's a quiet question beneath the surface. Is this truly my choice, or am I echoing what the moment expects? Yet speaking this truth aloud risks breaking the social fabric, so the mind lets the silence stand, even when it carries direction. The turning point arrives when someone begins to see silence not as a void, but as a message. A deliberate pause gains shape. A lack of response becomes meaningful. The absence of words becomes its own form of communication, one that guides behavior as surely as direct instruction. Integration comes with understanding that silence is not neutral. It influences, it guides, it molds behavior through subtle pressure that feels natural because it mirrors the human desire for belonging. With awareness, the weight of silence becomes visible. It no longer presses quietly from the edges. It becomes a recognized force, one that can be met with clarity instead of unconscious conformity. In the stillness of that recognition, influence reveals one of its softest truths. Words shape thoughts, but silence shapes instincts. And instincts, once awakened, rarely move without direction. Human emotions rarely move in straight lines. They rise, fall, drift, and circle back, creating subtle openings where influence can take root without ever appearing intentional. Emotional guidance, when done quietly, doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like resonance. It feels like being understood, even when the understanding is gently shaped rather than naturally found. This is where the final layers of silent influence live. Inside the emotional rhythm, people rarely question but constantly follow. Recognition often begins with a familiar feeling, leaning towards someone who seems to get the moment. A person who mirrors emotion just enough to convey understanding, yet shifts the tone slightly to guide the emotional direction. This is emotional pacing, meeting someone where they are, then adjusting the emotional temperature 1 degree at a time. A calm voice in a tense moment, a softened expression when frustration rises, a sympathetic silence before a carefully placed suggestion. Emotion becomes the steering mechanism, subtle and nearly invisible, because it aligns itself with what the other person already feels. The roots of this pattern reach into the human longing for emotional attunement. From early childhood, safety is often experienced not through logic, but through emotional synchronization. A caregiver who soothes, a voice that steadies, a presence that knows when to hold space and when to guide forward. These early experiences teach the mind to trust emotional alignment as a sign of safety. Later in life, that same trust makes emotional pacing an effective form of influence, one that feels like comfort, not direction. Psychologically, emotional influence thrives through contrast. The mind pays attention when a shift occurs, from worry to reassurance, from confusion to clarity, from vulnerability to warmth. This shift opens the door for the final psychological pattern, selective reward. A moment of approval when someone behaves in a desired way, a small withdrawal of warmth when they shift away from the expected path. It is rarely obvious. Often it appears as subtle encouragement, a quiet smile, or a brief softening in the eyes. The brain responds instinctively, drawn to the validation that feels earned but is actually orchestrated. The inner conflict here is deeply human. People feel pulled toward emotional closeness, yet uneasy when the direction of that closeness seems pre-shaped. There's a quiet tension between the desire to be understood and the fear of being guided without noticing. This tension often goes unspoken. Acknowledging it risks disrupting the emotional connection the person values, so the mind allows the pacing to continue, trusting the comfort even while sensing the hidden structure beneath it. The turning point emerges when emotional patterns begin to repeat. Someone realizes that warmth appears most strongly when their choices align with another's desires. That reassurance arrives at specific moments. That approval follows a predictable rhythm. This realization transforms emotion from something felt to something observed. And in observation, influence loses its invisibility. Integration does not reject emotional influence. Instead, it invites clarity. It recognizes that emotions will always respond to pacing, rhythm, and subtle reward, but awareness brings choice back into the equation. Understanding these patterns turns silent control into visible structure, allowing distance where needed and connection where safe. Influence rarely hides in darkness. It hides in the warmth of being seen, in the comfort of resonance, in the allure of emotional harmony that feels natural, even when it gently shapes the path ahead.